Hello, can you hear me okay? Just type in yes if you can hear me. All right, so we're going to be looking today at speaking, and I'm going to give you some tips for what to do and what not to do to be successful in the IELTS speaking test. So what do you have to do in the IELTS speaking test? Well, as most of you probably know, there are three parts. The first part, you need to answer questions about yourself. This is what we call small talk. This is where the examiner will ask you questions like, what's your name? Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you study? What kind of work do you do? Okay, general information, personal information. The second part of the test, you'll have to give a short presentation or tell a story about a specific incident or experience that you've had. In the third part, you're going to be discussing ideas or giving your opinion about certain things related to the short presentation topic. So let's look at part one, the introduction and interview, and how to make small talk. This is the section where the examiner will ask you a few questions. This will be background information about you. Try to keep your sentences or your answers no shorter than one sentence and no longer than two sentences in this section. So for example, where do you come from? Where do you live? And do you have a big family? Let's have a look at a few example answers to these questions. Again, your answers should be 1 to 2 sentences. So you need to be able to elaborate, not just give one-word answers. For example, where do you come from? If I said, I originally come from Lebanon. Now, this answer is okay, but it's too short. It's not elaborate enough. I should give a bit more information. I'm originally from Lebanon. My family comes from a small town in the mountains, about a 30-minute drive without traffic to the capital city, Beirut. Now, this is a better answer because it's 2 sentences and I'm giving a little bit more information about where I come from, not just the name of the country, but some information about my town as well. Where do you live? I live in Melbourne. Wrong, too short, not enough information. It's not showing off your ability to speak. This is a speaking test, so you need to give the examiner enough information to be able to assess your speaking. A better answer would be, where do you live? I live in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne with a friend. We share an apartment and it's a very nice neighborhood, but the rent there is quite expensive. So here I've answered the question with a bit more detail. Where do I live? Rather than just saying I live in Melbourne, I've said which part of Melbourne, the southeastern suburbs. And I've also said who I live with and a little bit of a description about the neighborhood. Nothing too long, maximum 2 sentences. So better answer. Question 3, do you have a big family? Yes, I have a big family. Wrong. Again, not enough information. I need to elaborate. Yes, I do. I have 3 sisters and many cousins. My parents both have a lot of siblings, so combined, we are a huge family. I've given a bit more information there. I've said, yes, I have a big family, and I've explained what I mean by that. I've said I have 3 sisters and many cousins. My parents both have a lot of siblings, so combined, we are a huge family. So I've given a bit more detail. Again, 2 sentences max. Okay, part 2. We want to tell a story. So you're going to be given a task card with a question usually related to an experience that you've had. It can be a movie that you've seen recently, a memory from your childhood, a trip that you have taken, a place that you have visited, a festival that you have attended in your city. So it's all going to be related to a personal experience. So this is where you have to tell a story. You need to make it interesting. So add interesting details, whether true or untrue. I find the easiest way to do this is to tell a true story or think about a true thing that happened, but make it more interesting by maybe embellishing on the details a little bit, meaning take the central idea as something that really happened, but then add some more untruths just to elaborate and make it more interesting. So let's look at an example here. Talk about a road trip that you have taken. You should say who you went with, where you went, what happened, and explain why you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it. Now, when I did the IELTS, this was actually the task card that I got. And I haven't really taken many road trips in my life, so I pretty much had to make it up. And I had 1 minute to do that because they give you 1 minute with a pencil to take some notes. I'm going to show you two answers. I'm going to show you two answers and then we'll talk about them. Answer 1. I will talk about a road trip I recently took. I went with my friend from Adelaide. I went with my friend to Adelaide. We drove along the Great Ocean Road. It was a long drive and we stopped a few places along the way to take pictures of beautiful scenery. We met some other tourists and they were really nice. We went camping and hiking and made a fire. I enjoyed this trip because it was fun and interesting. Okay, let's have a look at a second answer and let's compare them. I recently had one of the best experiences of my life since living in Australia. I took a road trip along the Great Ocean Road on the way to Adelaide with a lifelong friend. Along the way, we ran out of petrol. Now, this disaster actually became a great adventure. Some tourists were driving past and asked if we needed help. There were a bunch of German girls who were actually camping and asked if we would like to join them for the night. That night, for the first time ever, I camped on a beach, made a fire, swam in the ocean at midnight, and made some amazing new friends. After 2 days of unexpected experiences, the girls drove us to a petrol station and we got a can of petrol to put in our car. We parted ways and continued on our journey. This experience was so memorable because it taught me that sometimes good things can come from unexpected disasters if you're open and flexible. Now, which one of these answers is more interesting, A or B? So let's compare. I will talk about a road trip I recently took. Rather than saying or starting your presentation with, I will talk about, just talk about it. Don't announce what you will talk about, okay? So if we have a look at the first line, I will talk about a road trip, compared to, I recently had one of the best experiences of my life since living in Australia. Isn't that a more interesting and intriguing way to start a presentation? And then I go on to say, I took a road trip along the Great Ocean Road on the way to Adelaide with a friend. So I'm answering the question, explaining about a road trip, who I went with, what happened, we ran out of petrol. Why was it interesting? Because I got to do all of these things that I had never done before. And let me go back and see, what happened and why you enjoyed it. So I've explained here that I said because it taught me a lesson. It taught me that good things can come from what you think is a disaster. So I've put a bit of thought into it. Now, what this actually is a combination of a lot of different stories that have actually happened. The German tourists was actually from another experience that I had, not particularly this one. So I just sort of took bits and pieces from different memories and put them all together into one story to make it interesting, purely because I've never really had a road trip before. So if you do happen to get a prompt to talk about something that you haven't experienced, don't freak out. Just see it as an opportunity to be a little bit creative and merge different memories or merge different stories together. So I basically bluffed it or fluffed my part 2. Okay. So, and I answered all parts of the question. So talk about a road trip that I've taken. And here I said, one of the most or the best experiences of my life. Who you went with? I went with a lifelong friend. Where you went? To the Great Ocean Road. As you can see, you don't have to answer these in order. Okay, it doesn't have to, your answers don't have to follow the same order as the task card, as long as you in some way or another address the points. To say what happened, this is the body of my presentation. We ran out of petrol, we met these tourists, they invited us to camp with them, we made new friends, blah, blah, blah. And why I enjoyed it, because it taught me a life lesson. So as you can see, I answered all parts, but not necessarily in order. Okay, part 3, the discussion. This is a chance for you to really show off your vocabulary and show off your thoughts and ideas and opinions on things. So one way to do that is to explain how or why you think something. And you can do this by giving examples. You can also embellish by adding further specific details. And you can be thoughtful, so reflect on your ideas. Now, I'm going to show you what I mean by all of these. Now, part 3, the questions are usually going to be related loosely to the topic in part 2. So if part 2 was about a road trip, part 3 could be questions related to travel. So question 1, what do people learn from traveling? How should tourists behave when they visit your country? And what do you think is the best way for a tourist to travel if they want to learn about your country? Now, as you can see, these questions are not related to you personally, and they're not related to your experience. They're related to your ideas and opinions on things. Now, what happens if you've never really thought about these questions or you've never really reflected on these ideas? It's okay. You just need to be able to find a way to answer it. And if that means formulating your thoughts as you're speaking, that's fine. One way to buy yourself some time, rather than freezing and going silent or mumbling and fumbling with and really getting yourself nervous, honesty is the best policy. So you can actually say to the examiner, well, to be honest, I've never really thought of this before. I just need a moment to think about it. Or, that's really an interesting question. You know, it's not something I've considered before. Let me have a think about that. So there's nothing wrong with saying such things. Number 1, it shows that you're being thoughtful. Number 2, it shows that you're actually able to formulate and express yourself when you don't know the answer to something. And it also relaxes you a little bit and gives you a little bit of time to think. Okay, let's have a look at some examples to these questions. Question 1, what do people learn from traveling? People learn a lot of things from traveling, such as independence and knowledge of different cultures. Now, this answer might seem fine, but have I elaborated? Have I embellished? And was it very thoughtful? Haven't really elaborated that much or given examples or details. Okay, Plus, in this part of the test, part 3, you want to give longer answers, maybe 2 to 3 sentences. So let's look at another example. What do people learn from traveling? I think one thing they learn is independence. What I mean by this is that when you travel, you have to rely on yourself. For example, when I was traveling through Europe, I had to find my way on the metro on my own, and this was a challenge, but I learned to have confidence in myself. Much better answer than the previous one. I have elaborated. So although in the previous answer I said one thing people can learn from traveling is independence, well, here I've elaborated by saying what I mean by this is, what do I mean by independence? I've explained. Okay, I've embellished by giving an example of when I was traveling through Europe. And I was thoughtful by saying, well, how did that experience impact me? Well, it gave me confidence. And that's another thing that people can learn from traveling. Another possible answer here is, I also think people can learn more about other cultures, which makes them more open-minded. It allows you to see other ways of living, thinking, and behaving. It makes you realize that the way of life in your own country is not necessarily the right way, just a different way. So again, I've said traveling can teach people more about different cultures and make them open-minded. I've elaborated by explaining how. Well, it allows you to see other ways of living. And then I was thoughtful by saying it actually makes you realize that not one way of living is right, is the only right way. Another thing I did was use abstract language. So I talked about concepts like independence and open-mindedness. Okay, these are abstract concepts. They're ideas. And then I elaborated by explaining what I meant by them. What does independence mean? What does open-mindedness mean? And then I embellished by adding details and sharing my own experiences. And then I was thoughtful by discussing how these can have a positive impact. So you can see that part 3 is probably the more challenging and sophisticated part of the test. Let's look at question 2. How do tourists behave when they visit your country? Or how should tourists behave when they visit your country? First answer, tourists should be respectful of the country they are visiting. Now, although this is true, where's my elaboration? Did I explain what I meant by respect? So I've given the concept of respect, but I haven't explained what I meant by it. I haven't embellished. I haven't given any example of how you can show respect when you're visiting someone's country. And I wasn't really thoughtful in maybe explaining what you can learn from this. So let's look at a better answer. How should tourists behave when they visit your country? I think tourists should be respectful of the country they're visiting. One way of showing respect is by trying to learn the language. When I traveled to France, I made the effort to learn some basic phrases before I went, and I also tried to learn when I was there. The locals appreciated that, and I got a lot more out of the experience. All right, so what have I done here? I have embellished. I've elaborated. I mentioned the concept of respect, and then I elaborated, what do I mean by it? Well, one way to show respect is by learning the language. Then I gave an example from my personal experience of when I traveled to France. I made an effort to learn basic phrases. Then I was thoughtful by saying, reflecting on that experience and saying the locals appreciated that I made that effort, and I got more out of the experience as well. So, talked about respect, which is an abstract concept. I elaborated by explaining how tourists can show respect, learning the language. I then added details or an example of my own experience, and then thoughtfully explained how this can be of benefit. Question 3. What do you think is the best way for a tourist to travel if they want to learn about your country? The best way for a tourist to learn about my country is by visiting the local spots. Okay, fine, but that's only part of an answer. It's missing any elaboration or explanation, it's missing examples, and it's missing thoughtfulness. Let's look at a better example here. The best way for tourists to learn about my country is by visiting the local spots. By going to smaller towns and not just the tourist attractions, you meet locals, hear their stories, and experience real life. Otherwise, you only get the glossy version of the city and not the real one. For example, when some Australian friends of mine visited Lebanon, they stayed with me in my village and got to experience real home cooking, a local wedding, and family life. I also took them to the city, the beach, the restaurants, and other tourist places, but they got to experience both. This gave them a depth in understanding. This gave them an in-depth understanding of the country from the inside. So this is a longer answer, but you can see that I talked about the best way for tourists to visit my country is to visit local spots. So not just the cities, not just the tourist attractions, so the local spots. Then I elaborated by explaining why is it beneficial? Because they get to really learn more about the culture. I added details, an example from my own experience when my friends came to visit my country, and was thoughtful by discussing how this experience changed their view of my country. And gave them, a different idea about it. Okay, so part 3 is all about explaining your opinion or explaining your answer, giving an example of your answer, and then showing some reflection about it. Now, how is the IELTS speaking scored? So I'm just going to go through the criteria with you. You're graded in four different categories: fluency, vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. So let's start off by looking at fluency. Now, most of you are going to need between a 6 and an 8. So fluency basically is the ability to speak fluently without hesitation or repetition. Now, even native speakers sometimes hesitate or repeat themselves. If they're nervous, if they're in an uncomfortable situation, hesitation and repetition might happen even to native speakers. So really what you want to aim for is to allow for some hesitation and some repetition, but without losing coherence, meaning that even though you might hesitate in places or repeat yourself, you're not losing your spot, you're not having to stop and start again, your speaking still makes sense and the speaker can still follow you logically. So that's fluency. Next, we have vocabulary. Vocabulary means that you can use words and word forms precisely, accurately, and naturally. Now, most of you aren't aiming for a 9, and so let's have a look at what you would need to get a 7 or an 8 in vocabulary. That you use a wide enough range of words, and although there are some inaccuracies, possibly in word choice, so maybe you use an inappropriate word instead of the correct word, or you might make an error in word form. So for example, you might use the singular when you're supposed to use the plural, but these mistakes don't affect the examiner's ability to understand your message. Next, we're going to look at grammar. So, grammar is related to verb tense, correct sentences. Basically, you need to produce error-free sentences, meaning very, very little mistakes. So to get a 7, meaning that although you make some mistakes, most of your grammar is correct. To get a 6, it says uses limited grammar and makes frequent mistakes, meaning that most of your sentences contain mistakes. All right? Now, to get an 8, it means it's almost perfect with the occasional error here or there. And finally, we're looking at pronunciation. How's pronunciation graded? To get a 6, it means you can generally be understood, though some words here or there may be mispronounced and the examiner may not understand what you're saying. To get a 7, it means that although you have generally good pronunciation, it's not consistent. There might be some slips here and there, okay? And an 8 means that although you have an accent, every word is easy to understand, okay? So that's it. That's the IELTS speaking. Now's the time for questions if you have any. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for coming to this live class, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.